Before the sun cleared the hills, 3 riders appeared on the eastern ridge. They did not ride down. They stopped, watched. The kind of men who counted things before moving windows, exits, who were standing where. Below them, a ranch sat quiet in the gray light. A woman at the well, a man coming out of the barn. Neither of them looking up. On the kitchen table inside that house, a letter. One line underlined twice by a dying man's hand. You said that chance had passed. I disagreed then. The riders hadn't come about the letter. They'd come about the land. About a legal provision written specifically for situations like this one. About a woman who had no documentation and nowhere to go except 200 miles north. A horse shifted on the ridge, a match flared, went dark, nobody on the ranch saw it, not yet. The knock came before sunrise. Not on the door, on the gate. Holt Brennan heard it from the well, where he stood in the gray dark with a bucket in one hand and nothing particular in his mind yet, because his mind did not fully engage until the second cup of coffee, and the coffee was still 20 minutes away. One knock, silence. Then a second, not louder, just patient, the sound of someone who had already decided they would wait as long as necessary and saw no reason to advertise the fact. He set the bucket on the stone lip and listened. One horse. He could tell by the way the hooves shifted on dry ground, single weight. No companion mount, no creak of wagon axle. One rider. Not fleeing anything, not chasing anything. Just arriving, the way certain things arrive in a man's life without warning and without apology. And the only honest response is to walk toward them and see what they are. The sky above Rio Blanco had gone purple at the eastern edge, that specific color belonging only to the 20 minutes before the sun commits to showing up. It made the yard look older than it was. Or maybe it just made everything look exactly as old as it felt, which on a ranch that had been running for 15 years under the same pair of hands came out to about the same thing. Holt was 52 years old. He had the build of a man who had done physical work his entire life, and had never thought about it as anything other than what needed doing, shoulders that had widened through use, rather than vanity, hands that were more tool than ornament, a face that the sun and the years had worked on without asking permission. He moved through the dark yard with the unhurried pace of someone who had been walking this ground long enough that his feet knew every unevenness without being told. The fence on the north side had been sagging since March. He had been meaning to reset the posts. The barn door hung at a wrong angle because the ground had shifted under the east hinge foundation 2 winters back. The single chair on the porch faced east, the direction he had positioned it when he built the porch, and he had never thought to add another or move the one he had. He reached the gate. On the other side stood a young woman. 20, maybe 24, the low light made precision difficult. Black hair pulled back and tied, not elaborately, just practically, the way a person ties their hair when they expect to work and want it out of the way. A cotton dress that had been mended in several places by someone with patience and small, careful stitches. A leather satchel resting against her hip. A rolled blanket tucked under one arm. Dust on her boots that had come from more than one road. She was Apache. He could see that clearly in the structure of her face, high cheekbones. Dark eyes that held the kind of stillness that was not emptiness but its opposite. Too much awareness packed into a controlled surface. She was not shifting her weight. Not looking around the property to assess it. Not doing any of the small nervous things people do when they are unsure of their welcome. She was standing straight, patient. Present. My father said you'd take me in for a season. 6 words, flat and clean, the way an honest statement sounds when it requires no decoration. Holt did not open the gate. Who's your father? Frank Running Bear. A pause, small and precise. You knew him as Frank. The name landed differently than names usually landed. Not like information received. Like something recognized. Frank Running Bear. Frank, who had ridden out of a rainstorm in the summer of 1870 looking for trail work and stayed 3 seasons. Frank, who never complained about anything but told the truth about everything, which was a rarer combination than people generally appreciated. Frank, who could read weather and terrain and the moods of cattle with equal precision, and who had once talked Holt out of a bad creek crossing decision by saying nothing at all, just standing beside the horse with his arms folded until Holt figured it out himself. Frank, who Holt had not seen in 11 years and had thought about more often than he would have admitted to anyone. Frank's dead. The words came out rougher than he intended. The young woman lowered her eyes. Just briefly, just for one moment, the way someone does when grief is no longer fresh but is still capable of catching them at unexpected moments, when a name arrives before they have braced for it. 3 months now, Holt looked at her face. Young, watchful. Something around the eyes that was not quite tired, but was the specific expression of someone who has been carrying weight long enough that they have stopped noticing it as separate from themselves. He opened the gate. He said nothing. He stepped back, and she walked through, and that was how it began. Inside, the kitchen held the particular stillness of a room that has not had 2 people in it for a long time. Holt lit the lamp, sat at the table. The young woman stood near the doorway, not hovering, not uncertain, simply not sitting down in someone else's house until the space was offered. He recognized it as a kind of courtesy that most people had forgotten was a courtesy. He read the letter. Frank's handwriting had always leaned right, as though the words were in a hurry to get somewhere. The paper was old, soft at the folds, read more than once before it reached him. Holt, if Dessa reached you, give her 1 honest season. Fair work, fair pay. Let her choose where she goes after. You once told me your chance at a family had passed. You said that like it was a fact. I disagreed then. I disagree now. No instructions after that. No list of her qualities or her skills, or the reasons she would be useful. Just Frank, in 11 years of silence followed by 1 page, telling Holt what he thought without apologizing for thinking it. Holt folded the letter. He looked at the young woman in the doorway. She spoke before he could. I'm not looking for charity, steady. Not defensive, just stating a position that mattered to her and required clarity. I can mend fences, cook, ride, handle harness, and work from first light until dark. Whatever I don't know about this ranch, I'll learn. Give me 2 weeks and I'll know more than I don't. He looked at the stove, at the single pot, at the 2 plates on the shelf too, because he had never gotten around to reducing them to 1 after Clara died, and doing it now seemed worse than leaving them both where they were. Cot in the back room, he said. Supper at sundown, she nodded once. Walked down the hallway. The door closed quietly at the end of it. He sat at the table for a while longer with the folded letter in front of him. Morning light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, catching the edges of the 2 plates on the shelf. He looked at them, then looked away. Outside, the sun had finally committed. The yard went from gray to gold in the way it did every morning, which he had stopped registering as anything other than the signal to begin work. Except this morning he sat at the table a little longer than usual before going out. The first day settled into rhythm without anyone deciding that it would. Dessa running Bear Dessa. He had caught the name from the letter before folding it rose before he did. He came out to find coffee already made and waiting, not offered, just present, the way someone places something useful in a useful location without expecting acknowledgement. He drank it, standing at the kitchen window, watching her cross the yard toward the north fence line, walking with the specific purpose of someone who has learned early that intention in your step is its own kind of protection. The north fence posts had been sagging for 2 seasons. He had repaired them twice, and twice they had settled back into their lean, the ground too soft in that particular spot for any fix to hold, without addressing the drainage underneath. By the time he finished his 2nd cup, she had already identified the problem, and was doing something different, not just repacking the posts but resetting the angle, accounting for the direction the water moved through that section of soil after rain. He watched from a distance and did not go over. She did not look up to see if he was watching. That afternoon, the well rope which had been catching on a rough patch in the pulley housing for 3 weeks, and which he had been working around rather than fixing, ran clean and smooth. When he went to draw water at dusk, he ran his thumb over the housing. Someone had filed the rough patch down precisely, not rushed. He put the bucket back without mentioning it. Neither did she. They ate at opposite ends of the table and traded practical information the way 2 people exchange necessary facts without surplus. North fence is reset. Ground soft near the 2nd post. Needs gravel underneath. Creek bed. I'll get some tomorrow. Storm coming Thursday, maybe Wednesday night if the wind shifts south first. I already brought the extra blankets in from the barn. Grey mare is favoring her left rear. About a week now I saw that. I'll check the shoe in the morning. He cleared his plate. She cleared hers. He went outside. She stayed in. He sat in the single porch chair and listened to the ranch settle into night horses shifting in the barn, the creak in the distance, the dry creak of the gate hinge he kept forgetting to oil. And under all of it, faint and unhurried, the sound of someone moving inside the house. A drawer, a footstep, the ordinary sounds of a second person occupying space. He had not heard those sounds in 7 years. He sat in the chair for a long time after the fire in the house went dark. 7 years was long enough to make silence feel like a condition of the place itself, the way altitude was a condition or the particular quality of the heat in July. Long enough that a man stopped noticing it, the way he stopped noticing the slope of the yard, or the lean of the barn, or the single chair facing east on the porch. You did not think about silence when you were inside it. You only recognized its shape when something changed. He recognized it on the third morning when the kitchen smelled different before he reached it. Cornbread made while he slept, left on the iron plate without ceremony or comment. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it. He ate it standing. Because sitting down felt like acknowledging something he had not decided to acknowledge yet. On the 5th day, the broken harness straps that had been hanging behind the saddle rack since November, 4 of them, half hidden under an old piece of canvas, appeared stitched and ready on the main hook. Tight, even work, the kind that would hold through hard use. He had been using the backup set, which was also beginning to fail. He did not know how she had noticed the straps were there at all. On the 9th morning, an extra blanket waited folded on the porch railing. The temperature had dropped in the night. Harder than expected. He had slept in his coat and said nothing about it. He picked up the blanket and did not say anything about that either. There is a specific kind of competence that asks for nothing and explains nothing, and simply exists in the world as a fact. He had seen it in Frank, years on the trail, and had understood even then that it came from somewhere deeper than training, from a way of moving through the world that assumed nothing would be handed over, so attention became the only reliable tool. Watch, notice, act on what you see rather than waiting to be told what matters. He watched her work. Not constantly, not obviously, but with the corner of attention that kept returning even when he directed it elsewhere. She did not look back to check if he was watching. That, more than anything, was the thing he kept noticing. Most people looked back. She did not need to. 7 years earlier, fever had come through the valley in the first weeks of winter. Clara had been gone before spring arrived. They had been married 9 years. Long enough that the shape of his days had organized itself entirely around another person. And when that person was no longer there, the shape remained without the person inside it, which was a specific kind of emptiness that was worse than the kind that had never held anything. The room they had prepared, the plans they had made together about what the ranch would be and who would grow up on it, all of that had gone with her. And he had sealed off those rooms of his life the way you board up the windows of a structure you intend to keep standing but cannot bear to enter. 7 years of maintenance. 7 years of the ranch running, the cattle moved, the fences fixed. 7 years of doing what needed doing without thinking about who it was for or whether it amounted to anything beyond itself. He thought about this on the evening of the 9th day, sitting alone on the porch after Dessa had gone inside. He thought about it in the way he thought about most things, not with urgency or performance, just turning it over to see if there was something on the other side he had missed. There was a second person moving inside his house. He was listening for her footsteps without having decided to. He went inside earlier than usual that night. On the 16th day, Mabel Pruitt came. Mabel Pruitt had been the nearest neighbor to the Brennan Ranch for going on 20 years, which meant she had known Clara, and had been one of the people who brought food in the weeks after Clara died, and had been one of the people Holt had eventually stopped answering the door for, not from rudeness, but from the specific exhaustion of grief that makes even kindness feel like something that requires too much from you. She had understood. She had shown up anyway. It was one of her more useful qualities, and one of her more maddening ones, because it was very difficult to be cold to someone who understood you completely, and declined to stop caring anyway. She arrived with an apple pie. She knew he liked apple, and she had never been subtle about deploying the information, and set it on the porch railing, and stood with the expression of a woman who has come to say something specific and is choosing her approach. She's Apache, not a question. Yes, she's been here over 2 weeks, and you haven't mentioned it to anyone. Wasn't anyone's business. He leaned against the porch post. Still isn't. Mabel Pruitt used silence the way she used everything else deliberately, as a tool. She let it sit for a moment before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice had changed from social warmth into something with more structure underneath. Edmund Cray has been making visits, Holt. He's going around to the smaller operations east of town, looking at their labor arrangements. He has a survey crew scheduled for the fall. Cray works for the county. Cray works for whoever's buying the county's cooperation right now. Her eyes moved briefly to the east pasture, where Dessa was visible at a distance, working along the fence line. He has authority under the territorial labor statutes regarding Apache workers without documentation. Women specifically. There's a provision if he determines a woman is working a property without certified contract, he can refer her to the federal resettlement facility north of Santa Fe. The word settled in the air between them, north of Santa Fe. Nearly 200 miles, he's used it before. Twice in the last year. Smaller operations. Men who couldn't argue back effectively. She picked up the pie dish. She had already said what she had come to say, and Mabel Pruitt did not pad her exits. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I know. Because Frank Running Bear was a good man, and I imagine his daughter is a good person, and I'd rather you hear it from me than find out when Cray's horses are already in your yard. She left the pie and left. Holt stood on the porch, looking at the east pasture. Dessa had moved further along the fence line, working steadily, not looking up. The afternoon light came in long and low. The mountains in the distance were going purple at their tops. He did not go in to supper until the food had been sitting for 20 minutes. He did not tell her what Mabel Pruitt had said. He lay awake that night, listening to the stillness in the house, which was no longer the same stillness as before. There was a second person breathing at the end of the hallway, a second person who did not know that a man named Edmund Cray had been watching the ranch from the hills and had already formed a position about what he intended to do about it. He thought about Frank's letter, about the last two sentences. You said that like it was a fact. I'd disagreed then. He closed his eyes, opened them again. The ceiling told him nothing useful, which was what ceilings generally did. On the 15th day, which was the day before Mabel Pruitt came, in the ordering of things, though the significance of it only settled afterward, the barn ladder slipped. He was 6 feet up, checking a roofing section that had been loose since the last wind, and the bottom rung shifted on dry boards, and the whole structure went sideways, and he went with it. He hit the ground and lost his breath completely. The barn ceiling above the open door was very blue. His vision went white at the edges and then came back. He registered the particular suspended quality of the moment after a fall, before the body has decided how bad the news is going to be. A shadow fell across him. Someone crouching. Move your fingers, calm. Not alarmed. He moved them, both feet. He shifted them. Good. Don't sit up yet. Tell me if anything feels sharp, he assessed. Nothing sharp. His shoulder had taken the impact and was registering its objection, but nothing in the bone. His pride had taken a worse hit than anything structural, and he had no intention of making that information available. Nothing broken. He got the words out in 2 sections because his lungs were still settling. I'm fine. You hit hard enough that the ground bounced you. Her hands were already checking his shoulder, practical, not gentle, the way you check something when you want actual information rather than to comfort. You're intact. That's not the same thing as fine. Close enough. No. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has said something true and is waiting to see whether it will be received or deflected. It really isn't. He looked up at her. Dark eyes. No alarm in them, which confirmed the situation was probably not as bad as it felt from the barn floor. No pity either, which told him something else. She was watching him the way she watched everything attentively, without managing what she saw. You're not made of glass, she said, but you're not made of nothing either. She offered her hand. He looked at it for a moment, calloused, steady, offered without ceremony. He took it. She pulled. He came up from the floor and stood, slightly unsteady, and she stepped back to give him room without making a point of giving it. He looked at the ladder on the barn floor. Bottom rung was loose, I know. I was going to fix it this afternoon. A pause. Dry. I was slightly too slow. He looked at her, something at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of something being true without the full commitment of an expression. She turned and walked back toward the fence line, and he stood in the barn doorway watching her go, and thought for the first time in a very long time, And without quite deciding to think it, that the ranch sounded different when there was someone else's footsteps moving through it. That evening, the supper table held a different quality of quiet. Not less, the room was as silent as it had been every other evening, but the silence sat differently. He noticed her watching the lamp flame. She noticed him watching her. Neither of them said anything about it. After supper, he brought a chair outside. Not the porch chair, a second one from inside, because he had picked it up without thinking and only understood what he had done when he set it down and it was already there. He sat. Stars came up the way they always did over New Mexico, not gradually, but all at once, as though the sky had been waiting to exhale. He had grown up under this sky and had long since stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing anything that has always been present, footsteps behind him. Dessa lowered herself into the second chair without asking about it, the way someone sits in a place that has made room for them without quite intending to. The fire between them was small and mostly embers, throwing more shadow than light. My father used to say those lights up there are campfires. Her voice was different outside, in the dark, less contained, the way voices are when there is more room around them, left burning by the people who walked before us. So the ones who came after would know they weren't the first. He looked up at the sky, and looked at it the way he had looked at it when he was young, not as a clock, not as a ceiling, not as the roof of a space he was maintaining, but as something someone had thought to light, for the benefit of people they would never meet. Frank talked that way, he said. His voice came rougher than expected, from disuse rather than emotion, about the people before. Wasn't nostalgic about it. Just it mattered to him. He spent a long time learning how to hold two things at once. She was looking at the coals, the old way of seeing the world and the direction the world was pushing him to see instead. He said the only honest position was to refuse to drop either one. Holt thought about Frank on the trail, reading weather and terrain with equal ease, moving through a world that did not particularly welcome him by simply declining to adjust his pace for its discomfort. He talked about you, said simply. Not as a gift? As a fact? What did he say? She was quiet for the duration of deciding what was accurate. That you were the only man he trailed with who never pretended hard things were easy. He said most men either complained too much or pretended too little. You just did the thing and told the truth about it afterward. Something in his chest shifted without announcement. Where will you go? He said. After the season, she drew a line in the dirt with a small stick, curved it, started another. I don't know anymore. Before my father died, I had a clear picture of what came next. But pictures don't hold the same shape when the person who helped you build them is gone. The stick went still. She looked up at the dark above them, the scattered fires. I want somewhere that doesn't ask me to become someone else before it lets me stay. He heard what was inside that sentence. He had never been asked to be someone different. He had been allowed to exist as he was quiet, not particularly expressive, more at ease with honest work than honest speech, and the world had accommodated him without requiring renovation. Frank had not had the same accommodation, and the young woman sitting across the coals from him had walked through his gate carrying everything she owned in one bag and had said without apology, I am here, let me be useful, not help me, not take me in, not even, please, just, I am here. He looked at the coals for a long time. Frank raised you right, he said finally. She looked across at him. Something in her expression moved, small, controlled, but he caught it. A person who has learned not to expect to be seen in the exact instant that someone sees them. He raised me to notice, she said. He said everything else follows from that. They sat by the dying fire for another hour without speaking, and it was the least empty silence Holt Brennan had sat inside in 7 years. 3 days later, he came home early because of rain. The storm came fast, the way April storms did. Dark sky, one crack of thunder, then water coming sideways. He came in through the back door and stopped. Dessa's satchel was open on the kitchen table. Its inner lining turned out to dry. The papers that had been inside it were spread flat to keep from wrinkling. He had not meant to look, but his hands stopped. Sheets covered half the table. A horse in full run through canyon dust, the muscles of its neck drawn with the accuracy of someone who had looked at a horse moving and actually seen it. A hawk above a rock formation, wings spread at the specific angle of a thermal. Mountains at the exact moment when the afternoon light goes sideways and everything turns the color of rust. And one drawing, small and careful, an old man's hands around a coffee cup, knuckles swollen, grip loose but present, not posed, Frank's hands. He knew without question. He picked up another sheet, his ranch, not corrected or improved the barn at its real angle, the gate with its particular lean, the cottonwood by the well with the branch that had grown at a right angle before correcting itself, giving the tree a shape he had long since stopped registering. She had drawn it the way it actually stood, as though the truth of the place was the point. He was still looking at it when she came in from the east door, rain on her shoulders. You weren't meant to see those, not alarmed. Just noting a fact that had already become true. You drew these, my father taught me. He said if you learn to draw something, you learn to really see it. Most people look. Drawing forces you to see. He set the sheet down carefully. You notice things I stopped seeing a long time ago. She stepped closer and picked up the drawing of the barn. That's what happens when someone lives beside something long enough. It becomes furniture. You stop looking at furniture, she set it back. This is a good barn. The angle isn't its fault, it's the ground settling. People would spend money for a barn built this well. He looked at the sketch again. And then, because it was true and because he had not fully thought through what he was about to say before he said it, people in town would pay good money for pictures like these. You could sell them. She stopped. The stillness was immediate and complete. She set down the drawing she was holding, looked at him with the expression that took him 2 full seconds to read, not shock, not anger. The expression of someone who has just had something offered as truth converted instantly into a transaction, and who knows the difference between those two things because the difference has mattered to her for a long time. A compliment and a use are not the same thing, said quietly, evenly, no heat which made it land more accurately than anger would have. He opened his mouth, closed it. He understood exactly what he had done. He had looked at drawings that saw his ranch more clearly than he had seen it himself. Drawings that included his father's hands and his own in the same careful study, and his first instinct had been to establish their market value. Not to say, you see what I stopped seeing. Not to say, you drew Frank's hands and something in my chest ached. Just someone would pay for these. As though the only honest response to something of value was to determine what it was worth to someone else. She gathered the papers back into the satchel with practiced movements, closed the flap. He stood in the kitchen and understood that he could not undo this by explaining his intention. The evening passed in the old quiet. He lay awake, he ran what she had said through his mind, the way he turned a stone over to check the underside. A compliment and a use are not the same thing. He had seen those drawings, true drawings, drawings that found things he had become incapable of finding, and had immediately reached for their practical application, as though value required a transaction to become real. As though noticing was only worth something if it could be converted. He thought about Frank's letter. You said that like it was a fact. He thought about the way she had walked through his gate without asking for anything except exactly what she asked for. About the drawing of his hands at the well which he had not yet seen in full but somehow knew existed because of the way she looked at everything. He was up before dawn. He walked to the end of the hallway, knocked on the back room door. Heard movement. She was already awake, which did not surprise him. The door opened. She waited with the careful expression of someone who has learned not to anticipate what a door is bringing. You were right, he said. I'm sorry, no context. No explanation of what he had done wrong or what he had meant or the good intention behind the bad execution. Just the truth, said plainly. The way Frank had always delivered truth with the confidence that an honest man could receive honesty without requiring it to be softened first. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right. He went back to the kitchen and started the fire under the stove. After a few minutes, he heard her footsteps moving toward the east door, headed to the pasture. Moving at a different pace than the morning before. Not rushed, settled. 3 days later, he came in from the south fence to find a folded sheet of paper on the kitchen table. He opened it. The well drawn from memory in morning light, the rope in motion, and at the center of it, his hands on the rope weathered, work-scarred, holding with the particular grip of someone who has done this same action so many thousand times it has become indistinguishable from breathing. Every line of them exactly right. He traced the edge of the paper with one rough fingertip, and in the reflection at the mouth of the well, in the dark water below, 2 shadows. 2 figures standing side by side at the edge. He stood at the table for a long time. Then he folded the drawing with the same care he had folded Frank's letter and placed them together in the kitchen drawer, one on top of the other. Outside, the afternoon moved across the yard. A meadowlark started and stopped somewhere on the south fence line. The cottonwood by the well shifted in a breeze that came and went without committing to anything. He went back to work. That evening, after supper, Dessa set down her fork and said, without looking up from the table, "I need to tell you something my father left out of the letter." He waited. "A man named Edmund Cray controls land and labor documentation for this county." Her voice was measured, even, the voice she used when she had already processed the emotional content of something and arrived at the facts on the other side. "He's a territorial agent with specific authority over Apache workers on non-reservation land. Arrangements like this one, informal, undocumented by his standard, fall under his jurisdiction. He can declare them non-compliant." She held his gaze. "If he does, he has the authority to transfer me to the federal resettlement facility north of Santa Fe. Nearly 200 miles. The kitchen was very quiet. Why didn't Frank tell me? He wanted you to choose freely, no reproach in it, just the fact. State it the way Frank would have stated it. He didn't want pity making the decision. He wanted you to know me first. To know me as a person before I became a problem you had to solve." Holt looked at the drawing in the kitchen drawer. He could not see it, but he knew exactly where it was. The two shadows in the water. He looked toward the east wall in the direction of the hills beyond it, where Mabel Pruitt had told him, 16 days ago, that 3 riders had been watching from a rise above the property, where on 3 separate nights in the past month, he had noticed small lights on the high ground that he had registered as passing riders and dismissed. They had not been passing. Cray had not been approaching. He had been watching, counting days, building a record of exactly what he needed to justify whatever he had already decided to do. "He already knows you're here," Holt said. Not a question. Dessa's hands tightened slightly against her skirt, then released. Long enough, he nodded once. He did not say, "I'll figure something out." He did not say, "Don't worry." He said nothing because nothing he could say in this moment was as useful as thinking clearly about what came next. And he needed to think clearly about what came next. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. She looked at him, then nodded once, stood, cleared the plates, and went to the back room. The door at the end of the hall closed quietly. Holt sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight for a long time. Frank's letter was in the drawer. The drawing was on top of it. The 2 plates were on the shelf. The single chair on the porch faced east, toward the hills where a man had been watching and waiting and building his case in the dark. "You said that like it was a fact. I disagreed then. I disagree now." He got up, put the kettle on for morning. There would be coffee. 2 people would need it. And before that coffee, he needed to decide what kind of man he was going to be about this, which was not actually a decision he needed to think very hard about, because he already knew. He had known since the moment she said, he didn't want pity making the decision. Because that was exactly the same reason Holt Brennan had spent 7 years not asking anyone for anything. He rode into Rio Blanco before the town had fully committed to being awake. The main street held that specific morning stillness belonging to working towns, not peaceful, more like the pause before machinery engages, when everything is in position but nothing has moved yet. The general store was unlocking. The livery was already open because liveries were always already open. A dog crossed the road in the middle distance without urgency and disappeared between 2 buildings without explanation. Holt tied his horse at the post outside the county office and went in. Chester was behind the desk sorting mail, which Chester was almost always doing, because the mail was the one thing in the county office that generated predictable paperwork on a predictable schedule. He was a thin man in his late 40s with an ink stain on his left index finger that had been there long enough to be considered permanent. He looked up when the door opened, looked back down, then looked up again when he registered who it was. Brennan, a nod. Early for a ranch call, not a ranch call. Holt set his hat on the counter. "I need to know about Cray's authority under the territorial labor statutes, specifically the provisions covering Apache workers on non-reservation land." Chester set down his mail. The small shift in his posture, the slight drawing in, the careful arrangement of his expression into something professionally neutral told Holt everything about how known this situation already was. Before Chester said a word, "You've got one staying out at your place. I have an employee." Frank Running Bear's daughter, 24 years old. She has been on my property for 6 weeks doing specific labor for fair compensation. I want to know what Cray can and cannot legally do. Chester picked up a pencil, set it down, picked it up again, the movements of a man thinking about something he would rather not be thinking about. Cray's authority is real, Holt. It's written into the Territorial Code from 1878. Non-reservation native workers without a certified long-term employment contract can be referred to federal resettlement if Cray determines the arrangement is his word is informal. What makes an arrangement formal? Registered contract. Long duration. Countersigned by the property owner of record. Chester paused in the deliberate way of someone who has more to say and is deciding how directly to say it. Or marriage. Registered marriage gives her full territorial standing. She'd be on record as a property resident with legal protections that Cray's statute cannot reach. Holt said nothing. Chester looked at the desk surface. There's something else you should know, and I'm telling you this as someone who has known you for going on 18 years, not as a county employee. He kept his voice even. Cray doesn't operate on his own timeline. He operates on someone else's. There's a railroad survey crew coming through in the fall. They're looking at the land corridor east of your property line. Cray has been very useful to certain people in clearing complications before the survey arrives. Complications meaning people, complications meaning situations that might complicate land acquisition. Chester met his eyes directly. He is not acting alone, and he is not acting on principle. Keep that in mind when you're deciding how to move. The long-term employment contract, if it's registered with the county and correctly executed, does it elder against a formal inquiry? Chester turned to the filing cabinet behind him, ran his finger along a row of folders, stopped, pulled one and opened it. Looked at Holt over the top of it. If it predates Cray's formal inquiry, yes. A pause. He opened a file on your property 11 days ago. 11 days, 3 days before Dessa had told him anything. 5 days after Mabel Pruitt had come with her pie and her careful words about the survey crew and the small operations east of town. Holt put his hat back on. Thank you, Chester. Holt. Chester's voice dropped a register, quiet and measured. Be careful how you move on this. Cray doesn't lose gracefully, and he doesn't lose without redirecting. He walked out into the morning street and stood beside his horse without mounting. 11 days. The file was already open. Even a correctly executed and countersigned contract would be reviewed against that inquiry date, and Cray would argue that the formalization had been reactive, a response to the threat rather than an existing condition. Which was technically accurate, because it was. Which meant Cray had structured this precisely. Which meant he had done this before and knew exactly which angles were covered and which gaps he could exploit. Which meant the contract alone might not be sufficient. Holt stood on the wooden sidewalk of Rio Blanc's Main Street and thought about what Chester had said, about what marriage meant under the Territorial Code, about Frank's letter and its final 2 sentences and the way he had read them 40 times in 6 weeks without letting himself read them straight. He thought about Dessa at the south fence line, Dessa in the kitchen with the drawings spread across the table, Dessa saying, without heat and without flinching, a compliment and a use are not the same thing. He thought about 2 shadows in the water at the bottom of a well. And he understood not as a decision he was arriving at in this moment, but as a fact he was finally letting himself acknowledge that he had already decided. He had decided somewhere between the barn floor and the folded drawing in the kitchen drawer. He had decided and had not said it because he was a man who was more comfortable with action than with declaration, which meant he needed to locate the right action before the words had anywhere to go. He mounted. The road home felt shorter than the road in, not because the distance had changed. He came back to find the horse tied at the east post and Dessa not in the yard. Then he saw her, coming in from the direction of town on the south trail the long way around, which avoided being seen on the main road at the same hour he had been on it. She had timed it, which meant she had also gone into Rio Blanco, which meant she had not waited to hear what he found out. She unsaddled without looking at him. He unsaddled without looking at her. 2 people performing the same task in the same space without coordination, which required a surprising amount of peripheral attention to manage without collision. Chester, he said. Chester, she confirmed, setting her saddle on the rail. You talked to him. Before you, she checked the horse's water. I wanted to know the complete picture before you came back with part of it. He turned to look at her directly. And she reached into the leather satchel and set a folded sheaf of papers on the fence rail between them. He picked it up and opened it. 72 days of labor, every one of them. The date, the task, the hours worked. The equivalent market value for that category of labor in Rio Blanco County. Based on rates he recognized as accurate, she had researched them, probably from records in the county office, probably while Chester was occupied with other things. Every entry in her clear, slanted hand. The total at the bottom was a number that represented what he had not yet paid her, because they had been operating on the one-season arrangement Frank had outlined without specifying the terms. He looked at the total, then looked at her. "My father told me," she said, and her voice was the level practical register she used when she had long since processed the emotional content of something and arrived at the facts that remained. Never walk into a room without knowing where the door is. Cray has been watching this ranch for weeks. He has a file open. He has authority and he has backing. She met his eyes. "I have documentation. If you'll countersign it, I'll countersign it." "I know you will." A pause. Brief, precise. "You should also know it may not be sufficient on its own. The file predates the registration, I know. Chester told you." "Chester told me." She picked up the pages and held them out. He took them, went into the house, sat at the kitchen table, and countersigned every page with the pen from the shelf, while she stood in the doorway, not sitting until the space was offered, the same precision she had maintained from the first night. Except he understood it differently now. It was not submission or uncertainty. It was the knowledge of exactly which space was hers and which was not, and the refusal to take what had not been given, because she had spent her entire life in a world that resented assumption and only ever offered. He finished the last page, pushed the stack toward her. She sat down, across from him, at the kitchen table, for the first time without the prompt of a meal between them. Their shoulders were perhaps 12 inches apart. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle it came at this hour, catching the edge of the two plates on the shelf. "He'll still challenge it," she said. "I know, you have an idea, not a question." She could tell he still did not fully understand how, but she consistently could, the way she could tell what the weather was doing before the sky showed it. "I have an idea," he said. "I'm not ready to say it aloud yet." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. All right, which was more trust than the situation technically required. They both understood that. Neither of them said so. April moved into May without ceremony. The yard changed the way yards change when a second pair of hands works them, not in large visible shifts, but in the accumulation of small corrections that individually mean little and collectively mean the place looks like someone is paying attention to it. The gate hinge he had been meaning to oil. The cracked water trough that had been cracked since the previous summer, now repaired with iron banding done correctly, not rushed. The east side of the barn roof, which had been losing shingles one at a time since a February wind, patched and sealed before the spring rains arrived with something to find. He fixed things because they needed fixing. She fixed things because she noticed them. The difference in motivation produced the same result, but felt different in the living of it. The way two roads that arrive at the same place can feel entirely unlike each other, depending on what you passed on the way. He was aware of her the way you become aware of something that has entered your field of vision and refuses to stay peripheral. Not intrusively, not uncomfortably, just present. The way a second sound in a room changes the room before you have consciously registered what you are hearing. She was learning the ranch's particular logic. The way water moved through the southeast corner after heavy rain, which affected where fence posts would hold and where they wouldn't. The way the horses had a specific hierarchy at feeding time that disrupted. If the order changed something, Holt had accommodated for years without ever articulating it, until he watched her figure it out through 3 days of observation and begin operating accordingly without comment. The way the afternoon wind came off the rocks at a specific angle that dropped the barn temperature fast enough to matter if animals had been working hard. She asked questions when she didn't know. Not many. She preferred to work things out through looking and preferred information, only when observation would take longer than asking. But when she asked, the questions were precise, and she listened to the answers completely, and she did not ask the same thing twice. One afternoon, a dust storm came in from the west with less than 10 minutes of warning. They were both in the yard when the horizon changed color, that specific brown-yellow that means the air is thickening. No discussion. He ran for the barn to close the upper vents and settle the horses. She ran for the supply shed to hold the door latches, which had been on his list to replace and had not been replaced, and would not hold in real wind without someone's weight behind them. The storm lasted 90 minutes. They ended up in the barn because the supply shed was too small to wait in with any comfort, and the house was across 30 feet of open yard, running at 40 miles an hour of horizontal dirt. He sat on a hay bale near the stalls. She sat on the feed trunk against the opposite wall. The horses were quiet. She had gotten them settled before the worst hit, and settled horses helped each other stay calm, which was something he had observed her understanding without being told. The noise outside was considerable. Inside, the barn held against it with the solidity of something built correctly. Under the roar and the drum of debris on the roof, there was a quality of enclosure, of a doing what it was made for. He was aware of the distance between where he sat and where she sat. He was aware of not moving. She had a piece of paper. She was drawing in the reduced barn light with the concentration of someone who does not require ideal conditions, because the seeing happens inside them and the hand follows. He watched her hand move. She was drawing the barn from inside it, the angles of the beams, the high window, the horses visible at the edge of the frame. She did not look up to see if he was watching, which was different from before. Before, she never looked up because she was operating in her own purpose-built world. Now she was not looking up the way a person does not look up when they are comfortable with who is present. The distinction was small. He registered it anyway. He chose not to remark on it. Outside, the storm concluded in its own time. They walked back across the yard separately, which was habit, but within a few feet of each other, which was becoming habit. And the yard smelled like turned earth, and the sky had gone that clean, exact blue that exists for only a few minutes after a desert storm passes through, and then deepens into something more ordinary. 3 days after the storm, Mabel Pruitt came again. She did not bring anything this time. She came with herself and sat in the kitchen chair across from Holt with the expression of a woman who has finished deliberating and arrived at a position. The town knows she's here. The town has known. The town is forming opinions about what that means. She folded her hands on the table. Some are charitable, some are not. Most are watchings, which means they haven't decided yet and are waiting for something to decide against. People can watch. People can also repeat what they see to craze people. She held his gaze. I'm not alarming you. I'm making sure you have the full picture. The Arden boys mentioned to someone at the feed store that they'd seen an Apache woman working your south fence line. That someone told someone else. It's a small town, Holt. Information moves the way water moves. It finds every available crack. He looked at his coffee cup. What are people saying? That you have a hired hand. Mabel Pruitt paused with intention. Some say Apache girl. Some say young woman. Most are using the first one, which tells you something about where their assumptions are resting before anyone has given them better information. He thought about Dessa going into the feed store 3 weeks back for harness oil, because he had been on the north line and the supply was low. He thought about what that errand had looked like to people who had already positioned their opinions and were only waiting for a fact to resist them on. Crazed people came through the feed store the same day she did, Mabel Pruitt added, asking general questions about the Brennan property. Who's been working it? What kind of arrangements? Nothing specific. She stood. She had said what she came to say. I'd rather you know all of it than find out the parts you're missing at the wrong moment. She left. Holt sat at the table in the particular quiet of a house where someone is nearby but not in the same room. Through the window he could see the east pasture. Dessa was visible at the fence line, working at the same pace she always worked, not looking up. That evening he went out to the south fence where she was finishing the last section of a repair that had been on his list since February. He stood a few feet away. She kept working, completing the current action before stopping, finishing what was in hand before addressing what had arrived, which was how she always operated. She set the mallet down and turned. Mabel Pruitt came, he said. I saw her horse. She pulled off her work gloves. What did she say? Town knows you're here. Crazed people are asking at the feed store. He looked at the fence line straight now. Every post set correctly, the wire taut and even from one end to the other. There's something else I need to say. She waited. She was good at waiting, not the passive waiting of someone with nothing to offer, but the active waiting of someone who understands that some things need room to arrive. I don't want you to go. The mallet was still on the ground between them. Dessa went very still. Not the professional stillness she moved through her work with, not the defensive stillness she had arrived with at the gate. Something different. The stillness of a person who has heard a sentence they were not braced for and are absorbing it without machinery. What does that mean, Holt? He looked at her directly. Words cost him more than action did they always had, which was why he had let action speak for most of his life and left the words largely unused and unpracticed. But there were moments when action had nothing to offer, and language was the only available instrument. He had been arriving at this moment for 6 weeks, and he was not going to let imprecision waste it. It means this ranch is different with you here, slower than his usual pace, more considered. I've been living inside something without seeing it for a long time, and you walked in and started seeing it, and somewhere in these weeks I started seeing it again too. The barn, the cottonwood, my own hands at the well. He stopped and tried again because that was not quite the center of it yet. It means I go to sleep knowing there's someone else in the house, and the quiet is different. Not less, just different in a way I didn't know I was missing until it changed. He looked at the mallet on the ground between them, and then back at her. And I don't want to find out what it goes back to when you're not there. Dessa looked at him. The long moment that followed was longer than most people would have held. Holt Brennan was not most people. He waited. What are you asking me? Steady. Even. Asking for precision, not reassurance. I don't have the exact words for it yet, honest, because the alternative was to overstate something he hadn't fully located, and she would know the difference between what was true and what was shaped to sound true. But I know what I'm not asking. I'm not asking because of Cray. I'm not asking because of the statute or the file or Chester's county records. He held her gaze. I had this in my chest before I knew about any of that. I just hadn't finished finding out what it was. The fence stretched behind her in the late light, straight and taut and well built. The hills beyond it were going warm and gold. The sky above the hills was beginning its evening procedure, draining color from the top down. Ask me properly, she said quietly. When you know what you're asking, the smallest pause. I'll be here. She picked up the mallet and walked back toward the barn. He stood at the south fence for a long time after she had gone, watching the light change on the hills, feeling the thing in his chest that he had not yet named and understanding that naming it was the only honest next step. Not because naming it made it more real, because he was, at his core, a man who moved toward honesty the way water moved toward low ground, not always gracefully, but without the ability to stop. Edmund Cray came on a Thursday. No particular reason for Thursday, except that Thursday belonged to neither the beginning of a week nor the end of one, and a man who operated on careful timing would choose the day when a ranch was deepest in its routine and least positioned for disruption. 3 riders came from the East Road. Holt saw them from the barn doorway while working on the gray mare's shoe, which had been causing her real trouble and needed to be pulled and reset properly, rather than managed around any longer. He recognized Cray by posture before face, the specific uprightness of a man who has built a career on small authority and carries it in his spine at all times. 2 men rode behind him. Neither introduced themselves. They had the look of men hired for their size rather than their judgment, which told Holt everything about how Cray expected this visit to conclude. Mabel Pruitt was in the yard, also not coincidence. She had arrived an hour earlier with a question about a fence post she wanted Holt's opinion on, which was not unusual in itself, except that Mabel Pruitt had been managing her own fence posts successfully for 2 decades without his input. He had understood when she stayed. Cray dismounted in the center of the yard. He carried a leather case under his arm. His vest was clean. His boots were clean. He had come from an office, not from anywhere difficult. His eyes moved across the yard with the efficiency of someone cataloging, and they found Dessa at the well. And they stayed there 1 beat longer than they needed to, Mr. Brennan, even, businesslike. The voice of a man who has had this conversation in enough yards to find it predictable. I believe you're aware of why I'm here. I'm aware you've had a file open on my property for 11 days. Holt walked out of the barn without hurrying, which means you've been conducting an inquiry without notifying me, which I'd like noted for the record. A pause. small and controlled. Cray had not expected that opening. The inquiry was preliminary. It becomes formal today, because you're here. Because I'm here, he set his case on the fence rail, opened it, removed a folded document. The Territorial Labor Code, Section 14, I know what it says. Holt stopped 10 feet away. The distance of a conversation, not yet a confrontation. My employee has documented employment. Countersigned, dated, registered with Chester at the county office 4 days ago. Another pause longer. Cray had known about the documentation. Chester would have been required to note it, but he had calculated that the timing made it challengeable. Documentation filed in response to an open inquiry is subject to review for intent. Whether the formalization was genuine or reactive intent, in cases where records are filed after an inquiry opens, I have discretionary authority to assess the legitimacy of the underlying arrangement. Smooth, practiced. The voice of a man who has said this before and found it effective. Holt did not answer immediately, because what Cray had just said was technically true and structurally dishonest, and the space between those two things was where he had built his entire operation. Dessa walked across the yard, not toward Holt, directly toward Cray. She held out the sheaf of papers without ceremony. The documentation covers 72 days of employment. Every entry is dated, itemized, and valued at the county market rate for that category of labor. 21 of those days predate the date on which you opened your file. She held his gaze without blinking, not defiant, just stating facts to the person who needed to hear them. 30% of the record predates your inquiry, Mr. Cray. Your discretionary authority applies to reactive documentation. It does not apply to records that existed before you started watching. Cray looked at the papers. He did not take them from her hand. He read the top page in place. His expression held, but something behind his eyes recalculated. He looked at Holt, then back at Dessa. The arrangement requires registration as a formal long-term contract to fully satisfy Section 14's requirements. The registration is at the county office. Dessa did not lower the pages. Chester has it, filed Monday. Stamped and recorded. I'll need to verify, I expect you will. A pause, level and unhurried. Is there something else, Mr. Cray? The two men behind Cray shifted in their saddles. Mabel Pruitt, positioned near the gate, had arranged her expression into one of careful attention that she intended to remember accurately and completely. Cray looked at Holt. What he said next was said quietly, calibrated for Holt and not the witnesses, though both Dessa and Mabel Pruitt were close enough to hear it. What I see on this property looks like more than an employment arrangement, Mr. Brennan. When situations are ambiguous, my discretion is broad. There it was. Not the statute. Not the documentation. The suggestion that he could make this into whatever shape he needed it to take, backed by authority he carried, and by people above his office who had reasons for wanting this land corridor unencumbered before the railroad survey arrived. Holt's voice, when it came, was flat and certain. She's my intended. Silence. Immediate and complete. The kind that occupies a space so thoroughly that even the horses registered it. Mabel Pruitt drew a breath. Dessa turned to look at him. Her expression was the one that took 2 full seconds to read. Not shock, not confusion, but the specific expression of someone who has just heard something they did not anticipate and are deciding whether it is true. Cray looked at him for a measured moment. That's a significant claim. It's the truth. You'll need documentation, proof of engagement, registration. You'll have it before the week is out. Holt held Cray's gaze until Cray's moved first, which it did, shifting to Dessa and then back to some middle distance as he performed his recalculation. Leave now. Cray picked up his case, closed it. He looked at Dessa one final time with the look of a man who is not noting defeat but is noting that this has become more complicated than anticipate and is already locating the next angle. End of the week, Mr. Brennan. He mounted. His 2 men followed. 3 horses went down the east road and did not look back. The yard settled into stillness. Mabel Pruitt stood at the gate with her hands folded and the expression of a woman who had just witnessed something she intended to describe accurately to a significant number of people before the sun went down. All of it true, all of it important. Holt turned. Dessa was looking at him. You should have asked first. Not angry, not wounded. Just stating, I know. You announced an engagement before discussing it with the person the engagement involves. I know that too. A long pause. The kind with actual weight. Her voice dropped slightly. Quieter than before. Ask me now. He looked at the ranch around him, the barn at its real angle, the repaired gate, the the cottonwood with its sideways branch, the south fence running straight to the tree line. Nothing about this moment resembled the way people described such moments in towns and parlors. No preparation, no ceremony, no audience arranged for the purpose. Just the yard and the two of them, and the truth of what the past 6 weeks had been. He took off his hat, not for effect, because he was a man who removed his hat when something mattered, and this mattered. I'm not easy to live beside. Each word chosen rather than habitual. 7 years alone makes a man rigid in ways he doesn't notice about himself until someone points them out. I still talk to Clara in my head sometimes, not because some part of me is living in the past, but because certain people become part of how you think, and that doesn't stop when they're gone. He looked down at the hat in his hands. I don't know how to make promises that sound large. I've never been capable of that. He looked back up at her. But I can promise what I actually know how to do. I'll notice when you're tired. I'll remember how you take your coffee black, no sugar, lukewarm, because you pour it and then go back to work and drink it an hour later. I'll listen when you speak, not just wait for you to finish. I'll see you every day. His voice dropped. Not from emotion breaking through, but from arriving at the center of something and speaking from there, without performance or inflation. And I don't want to stop. The afternoon held still. Then Dessa said, in a register he had not heard from her before, not the professional voice, not the campfire voice, but the voice underneath both of those, the one a person uses when they have stopped managing what shows on the surface. My father told me the month before he died that wanting something again doesn't mean you've forgotten what you had. He said it means the same heart that loved well once is still working, still capable. She held his gaze. He said that's not loss wearing a new face. That's proof. The cottonwood moved in the slight wind. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and was still again. My father was rarely wrong about people, she said. He wasn't wrong about you then. Yes, one word. Small and exact, the way the most significant things tend to be. Holt reached out his hand. His real hand, calloused from decades of fence work and rope and everything else a ranch required of a body over time. Not a romantic hand, just a true one. Extended. Dessa looked at it, then she put her hand in it. Neither of them moved for a moment. The hills to the east held the last of the afternoon light. Far down the road, the dust from 3 horses had long since settled. Mabel Pruitt turned with great deliberate purpose toward the road, because she had a significant number of people to speak with before supper, and the light was not going to last forever. The south fence stood straight behind them, every post set correctly, the wire running taut from one end of the property to the other. Holt held her hand and did not let go. The road into Rio Blanco ran straight for the first mile, and then curved east along the creek bed before straightening again toward town. Holt had ridden it enough times that the horse knew the turns without instruction. But this morning, he was aware of every foot of it, the way the early light came off the water. The cottonwoods along the bank still holding their spring green before summer burned it to yellow, the particular quality of a morning that is carrying something and does not make a fuss about it. Dessa rode beside him. Not behind, beside. He had not arranged this. She had simply pulled her horse up alongside his when they left the gate. And that was where she stayed, and it occurred to him that this was how she had always operated, not waiting to be positioned, just taking the position that made the most sense, and holding it without apology or explanation. They did not talk much on the ride in. There was not much to say that had not already been said, and neither of them was the kind of person who filled silence to make it easier to sit inside. The silence they rode through had the quality of something settled. Not finished. This was not a morning that was finishing anything but settled. Like ground that has been properly worked and is ready for what comes next. Rio Blanco arrived gradually the way small towns did. First a fence line, then a building, then the smell of wood smoke and horses and the particular mixture of sawdust and iron that belonged to working places. The main street was occupied by the time they arrived, the feed store open, the livery in operation. 3 women outside the dry goods shop who stopped talking when Holt and Dessa rode past and resumed when they had gone far enough, which was not very far. He noticed. He did not react to it. He rode straight for the courthouse. Chester was already there. Chester was always already there. He looked up when the door opened and his expression moved through several stages: quickly recognition, assessment, Rapid internal calculation before settling into something professionally neutral that did not fully conceal whatever was underneath. Brennan, a beat. Morning, Chester. Holt set his hat on the counter. We need the marriage registration file today. Before noon if possible. Chester picked up a pencil, set it down, picked it up again. Cray came in first thing this morning. Neither Holt nor Dessa said anything. He filed a formal escalation on your employment documentation. Chester kept his voice even, the voice of a man delivering information he did not generate and is not personally responsible for, but takes seriously anyway. He's contesting the pre-inquiry dating on 17 of the 72 days. Claims the record for those specific entries was backdated. Holt looked at Dessa. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Chester with the expression she used when processing new information against existing knowledge: attentive, unhurried, finding the relevant angle before speaking. Which 17 days? Her voice was measured. Chester checked the file and read the dates aloud. Those are the days I worked the north fence reset and the supply shed door repairs. She looked at Holt. Did you keep the original harness straps? The ones from before I replaced them? He thought back. Behind the saddle rack. Under the canvas. Then there's physical evidence of the timing. The stitching on the replacement straps is mine. Anyone who knows the work can see the difference in method. The original straps are still there and show the wear pattern of something that had been failing for months before replacement. The east barn roof sections were re-nailed at a different angle than the original construction. The nail corrosion on the old sections compared to the new ones establishes the sequence clearly. She looked back at Chester. He's contesting those dates because contesting them cost him nothing and creates delay. Not because he has a factual basis for the challenge. Chester wrote something on the paper in front of him. I'll note that in the file. He looked up. It doesn't resolve the formal escalation. That goes to Harmon. Who is Harmon? Dessa asked, Director of County Administration. Cray's nominal superior. Chester chose his words with the care of a man who understood that what he said in this office could travel. Cray has significant latitude in how he frames information for Harmon. Harmon tends to accept his framing, so Cray had moved to insulate the escalation before they arrived. He had gone to his superior first thing in the morning, which meant he had anticipated this visit, which meant he had been tracking the registration filing, which meant he had planned his next step in advance and had done it before they had a chance to respond. Holt looked at Chester steadily. Is Harmon in today? He is. Is Cray still in the building? A pause with weight in it. His horses are at the side post. Holt picked up his hat. Put it on. File the marriage registration. Right now, while we're standing here. Chester pulled the correct form from a drawer immediately, which meant he had already pulled it before they arrived. Which meant Chester had his own position about how this morning should go and had been quietly preparing for it. He filled in the lines with practiced speed, stamped it with the county seal, signed it and slid it across the counter. Holt signed, passed it to Dessa. She signed. Chester stamped it a second time, the final stamp, the one that made it a record rather than a document, and filed it in the drawer to his left. Locked it, registered, Chester said. 8:47 this morning. He met Holt's eyes with the expression of a man who has done what he could do and knows it. Harmon's office is at the end of the hall. The hall of the Rio Blanco County office was not long. 30 feet of plank floor, 2 windows, a bench along one wall worn smooth by years of people sitting on it while waiting to be told things they did not particularly want to hear. Holt had walked it before for various ranch business and had never given it much thought. This morning it was a different kind of walk, because halfway down it, coming from the direction of Harmon's office, was Edmund Cray. He stopped when he saw them. So did they. 3 people in 30 feet of hallway, the morning light from the 2 windows leaving the middle stretch in relative shadow. Cray's leather case was under his arm. He had the look of a man who has just concluded one thing and is on his way to the next, which meant he had already been in with Harmon, which meant the escalation had already been presented, already framed, already sitting in Harmon's understanding in whatever shape Cray had given it. Cray looked at Holt, then at Dessa. Back at Holt, Mr. Brennan even. The same register as the yard visit. Convenient timing. We just registered our marriage with Chester. Holt kept walking. He did not slow or stop in the middle of the hall. He kept moving at the same pace, which meant Cray had to step aside or force a physical confrontation in a county building. and neither of those options was the position Cray preferred to be in. "I'd like to speak with Harmon." Cray stepped aside, because he had to. But as they passed, his voice came quiet and aimed precisely. "The registration doesn't resolve the escalation on the documentation dating. The formal process will proceed regardless." Holt stopped, turned, looked at Cray in the way he looked at something he was deciding how to handle without heat, without performance, just with the full weight of a man who has made up his mind and is done being managed. "The documentation is accurate, and you know it is. You're contesting it because delay serves your purposes and costs you nothing, even factual. The tone of someone who is not asking for agreement, only stating what is true. I'm going to speak with Harmon. After that, you and I will have nothing left to discuss." Cray held his gaze. "You're confident, I'm informed." A pause, exact and deliberate. "And I'm not alone." He turned back toward Harmon's office. Dessa walked beside him. Neither of them looked back at the man in the hallway. Harmon's office was small and overfull. The way administrative offices in small counties always became ledgers, stacked against ledgers, rolled survey maps in the corner, documents that had outlasted the urgency that generated them piled along the windowsill. Harmon himself was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a grey beard, and the practiced expression of someone who had been managing competing interests long enough that uncommitted had become his resting face. He stood when they came in, which meant Chester had sent word ahead, which meant Chester was, quietly and without announcing it, on their side, Mr. Brennan. He nodded at Dessa without quite meeting her eyes, a small evasion that Holt registered and filed without comment. "I understand you've registered a marriage this morning." "We have." Holt sat down across from Harmon's desk without waiting to be invited because they were past the social geometry of this kind of meeting. "I also understand Cray filed an escalation this morning, contesting the dating on 17 entries in the employment record." "He did." Harmon sat. "It's a procedural matter. The formal review process." Dessa set a document on his desk, not the registration. A second set of papers he had not seen. She had prepared them, either last night, after they decided to come in, or early this morning before he woke, and had said nothing about it. She had simply brought them, the way she brought everything she needed, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement of the preparation. The 17 disputed dates correspond to specific repairs, with physical evidence still present on the property, she said. The original harness straps, pre-repair, are in the barn. The replacement stitching is visibly different in method and can be confirmed by anyone with knowledge of the work. The barn roof sections were refastened at a different angle than the original construction, and the difference in nail corrosion between old and new sections establishes the sequence and approximate timing clearly. She held Harmon's gaze with the directness of someone who is not asking for a favor, but presenting facts to someone with the authority to act on them. Any carpenter or leather worker in Rio Blanco can confirm the physical record. Mr. Cray is contesting documentation that has corroboration. If the formal review proceeds, that corroboration becomes part of the record. Harmon looked at the papers. He was reading carefully. Holt could see the eye movement, the small pauses, the slight adjustments in his expression as the information shifted his understanding of what he was sitting across from. Then Harmon turned to a survey map on his desk. Territorial, the kind with property lines in thin ink and the new survey markers from 1878 overlaid in a different color. He put his finger on a section east of the Brennan boundary. "Mr. Cray has been effective in this county," Harmon said slowly, not defending, explaining. The distinction mattered, and he seemed to understand it did. "His work has had support from levels above my office. There is a railroad interests corridor running along this eastern section and a survey crew scheduled for the fall." He moved his finger along the map. "The Brennan property deed is a federal land grant, filed 1871, Dessa said. Filed 1871. Harmon looked at the map. "Before the Territorial Survey Authority was established. The authority was established in 1878, Dessa said. "The Territorial Code, Section 3, Paragraph 1 establishes that the 1878 survey markers apply to land registered after the Survey Authority's creation. They cannot be applied retroactively to land granted under federal authority prior to that date." She held his gaze steadily. Mr. Cray referenced the 1878 markers in his escalation as grounds for questioning the validity of the employment contract's property basis. The Brennan deed predates that authority by 7 years. His argument has no legal foundation. The office was quiet. Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Not the evasive look from the beginning of the meeting. A direct look, the look of someone reassessing what they are seeing. "Where did you learn?" he began. "My father spent 20 years watching men use paperwork to move people off land they had every legal right to stand on." Her voice remained level. But underneath the precision there was something with real weight to it. Something that had been carried a long time and did not need to be performed to be felt. "He taught me to read the documents they used, so I would know which arguments were real and which were constructed to look real to people who couldn't check the underlying law for themselves." Harmon was quiet for a moment that had texture to it. Holt looked at him and said nothing, because Dessa had said everything that needed to be said, and adding to it would only reduce it. Set it down, picked it up again. "The escalation," he said finally, in the careful voice of a man constructing a record in real time, "appears to have relied on survey markers that do not apply to this property under the relevant territorial code provisions." He looked at Holt, then at Dessa. "The employment documentation, with the physical corroboration described, is valid. The marriage registration is filed and legal as of this morning." He looked at the page in front of him. "I don't see a basis for continued formal inquiry." He wrote on the form, stamped it, set it in the tray on the left side of his desk. "Thank you," Holt said. He stood, Dessa stood, "Mr. Brennan." Harmon's voice stopped them at the door. "Men in Cray's position don't receive outcomes like this without response. I want to be clear that my office has followed the law today, and I expect everyone involved to continue following it." He looked at the stamped form. Including him, they walked out. The hallway was empty. Cray's horses were gone from the side post. By the time they came through the front door, he had read the direction of things and left before the outcome became a stamped document. Not a man who stayed to face conclusions. A man who moved to where the next opening might be. That too was its own kind of answer about what kind of man he was. Chester watched from behind the counter as they passed through. His expression had moved past professional neutrality into something that was probably as close to visible satisfaction as Chester allowed himself in working hours. He said nothing. He nodded once. The nod carried everything it needed to. They came out into the morning street, and the morning street was not the same as when they had gone in. Not a crowd. Rio Blanco was not a crowd kind of town, not for ordinary things, but the natural accumulation of a small town that has detected something happening. Mabel Pruitt on the far sidewalk, arms folded, having clearly been there for some time, and having no intention of pretending otherwise. Tom Briggs from the feed store in his doorway, leaning against the frame with the specific posture of a man who has found a reason not to go back inside yet. The two Hadley sisters outside the dry goods shop, not pretending to be doing anything other than watching. 4 or 5 other faces Holt recognized from years of supply runs and county meetings, distributed at comfortable distances in the way of people who want to see something without committing to having come to see it. Mabel Pruitt moved first. She crossed the street with the purposefulness of a woman who has decided which side of a thing she is on and intends to make that clear without requiring anyone to ask her. She stopped in front of them, looked at Dessa, looked at Holt, and said in a voice that carried well in the morning air, "I assume the county business went the right way." "It did," Holt said. She nodded with the gravity of someone confirming a verdict. Then she turned to Dessa, and her voice changed, still clear, still carrying, but with something underneath it that had nothing to do with county offices or territorial law. "Your father wrote to me once. 3 years ago. He had heard I was a neighbor to Holt Brennan, and he wrote to ask about the man's character." Dessa looked at her. "I didn't know that. I told him Holt Brennan was the most honest man in Rio Blanco County, and the most stubborn and probably the loneliest, and that whoever eventually got through his fence line would have to be someone with real patience and real spine." She held Dessa's gaze without wavering. "I told Frank Runningbear that if his daughter had those things, she might be exactly the right person." She looked from Dessa to Holt and back. "I was right, he was right. Between the two of us, we generally are." She walked away without waiting for a response, because Mabel Pruitt did not require responses when she had said what was true. Tom Briggs gave a slow nod from the feed store doorway, the specific nod of a man communicating respect through the most economical available gesture. The Hadley sisters went back into their shop but left the door open. The other faces either returned to their business or found reasons to cross in the Brennan direction, with brief acknowledgments that communicated what needed to be communicated without requiring anyone to make a speech about it. This was how a small town absorbed something new, not with announcement or formal declaration. With a series of small adjustments, the way a creek adjusted around a new rock, individually minor, collectively decisive, and permanent once the water had found its new path. Holt looked at Dessa. She was watching Mabel Pruitt's retreating back with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the professional stillness, not the campfire openness. Something underneath both of those. The expression a person makes when they have spent a long time expecting a particular kind of reception from the world and have just received a different one, and the system requires a moment to adjust to the new information. He did not say anything about it. She did not need him to name it for her. She knew exactly what it was. He stood beside her on the main street of Rio Blanco in the morning light and let the moment be what it was, which was enough, and more than enough, and the kind of more that a person cannot plan for but can recognize when it arrives. The wedding was on a Thursday, no particular reason for Thursday except that Thursday was available, and Justice Aldridge, who had been performing civil ceremonies in Rio Blanco for 16 years, had it open in his calendar. And waiting past Thursday felt unnecessary when everything that needed to be in order was already in order. The courthouse room where civil ceremonies were held was not large. A table at the front end, 2 windows with the morning light, a painting of a mountain range on the west wall that had been there so long, no one remembered who had painted it or which mountains it depicted. The chairs facing the front were arranged for perhaps 20 people. By 8 in the morning on Thursday, every chair was filled and 3 people were standing along the back wall. This had not been organized in any way Holt was aware of. He had told Chester the time and date because Chester needed it for the record. Chester had apparently experienced a failure of discretion, because by the following morning Mabel Pruitt had known, and from Mabel Pruitt the information had completed its natural journey to most of Rio Blanco by the afternoon, and here was the result. Holt stood at the front of the room in his white shirt, the one without visible stains, which was the only dress standard he was realistically capable of meeting on short notice, and looked at the assembled faces and felt something he had not expected. Not nervousness, the specific weight of being genuinely witnessed, not observed from a distance and discussed, witnessed, up close by people who had known him before and would know him after and had come to mark the distance between those two things. Mabel Pruitt in the front row, handkerchief already in hand. Chester beside her, ink on his finger as always, wearing the expression of a man who finds this proceeding deeply satisfying in a way he would not admit aloud. Tom Briggs in the third row, the Hadley sisters. The Arden boys in the back with the particular look of young men who have understood that they contributed to a situation they are now relieved resolved itself well. Various others, enough of them that the room was warm despite the morning air outside. Then Dessa came through the back door. She walked forward without ceremony, without anyone beside her, which was her choice and which was correct for who she was. She wore the dark blue dress with the embroidery at the collar and cuffs that she had made herself, in the evenings, in the time he had thought she was reading. Her hair was down. She moved through the room without looking at the assembled faces, her eyes on the front where he was standing. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The room was very quiet. Justice Aldridge began. The language of a civil ceremony in Rio Blanco in 1882 was brief and somewhat plain, which suited them both entirely. Neither of them had come here for language that was not true. When the formal portions were complete, Aldridge looked between them in the manner of a man who had learned that leaving space in ceremonies was generally better than filling it. If either of you has something to say, Holt looked at the room full of people. Then at Dessa, Frank Running Bear trusted me with the thing he could no longer protect himself, he said. Not loud. The room was quiet enough that it did not need to be. I intend to be worth that, simple, exact. The kind of sentence that could only be spoken by someone who understood completely what they were accepting. Dessa held his gaze, and when she spoke, her voice had the same quality, not performing, not projecting, just saying the true thing at the necessary volume. My father spent his whole life paying attention, watching, learning what people were actually made of underneath what they said about themselves. A breath, He was not wrong about you. This is the first time in months I have been glad he was right about something, because it means his judgment held, and his judgment was the best of him, and now I get to keep it." Aldridge completed the record, stamped it, said what needed to be said, and then it was done and registered, and a fact that would remain a fact regardless of what Edmund Cray or the Territorial Labor Code or the Railroad Survey Corridor had to say about any of it. Mabel Pruitt did not attempt to conceal the handkerchief any further. Chester looked at the middle distance with the intense concentration of a man who has decided to think about something else as an emergency measure. On the way out, Tom Briggs shook Holt's hand with a grip that communicated, in the compact language of men who don't use many words, about time. The Arden boys nodded at Dessa with the sincere awkwardness of people who know they owe someone something and are not certain how to pay it back except through acknowledgement. The Hadley sisters told her the embroidery on her collar was beautiful, which it was, and she thanked them with the directness of someone who has made a thing well and is comfortable being told so. The town did not transform overnight. Holt did not expect it to, and Dessa had never expected it at all. There would be people whose opinions would not be revised easily or quickly. There would be moments in the coming months that required navigation. He knew that. She knew it better than he did, and had known it longer. But standing on the courthouse steps with a stamped record in Chester's locked drawer, Holt looked out at the street where people were returning to their daily business, and understood that something had been established that was more durable than opinion. A fact in the county record, witnessed by more people than had come to his and Clara's wedding, which had been small and private by choice, and which he had never regretted. He did not regret this either. They rode home in the late morning. The road was the same road, the creek the same creek, the cottonwoods the same trees. Only the light was different, higher in the sky, now the spring crew moving toward its end, the green at the tops of the branches beginning to warm toward yellow. Dessa rode beside him, same as the morning ride in, same as it would be. What followed was not a single shift but an accumulation, the way all real changes accumulate incrementally, without announcement, visible only when you look back from far enough to see the whole shape of it, May concluded. June arrived and moved through itself with the particular intensity of a New Mexico summer that does not negotiate with anyone about its intentions. The work continued because work on a ranch did not pause for sentiment or legal proceedings, or the internal reorganization of a man's understanding of his own life. The cattle needed moving. The Southwest water source needed checking after a dry week. The north fence required attention again, because fences always required attention again, which was the nature of fences and also, perhaps, of most things worth maintaining. But the work felt different in the doing of it. Not easier hard work stayed hard, and the ground did not soften because a man was more settled than he had been in spring. Different in the way things felt when they were being done as part of something, rather than simply to occupy the hours between morning and dark. Supper was no longer a practical transaction. It had become a period of time with actual conversation in it, not just the trading of ranch information, though that continued, but conversation that ranged further, that circled back, that sometimes arrived somewhere unexpected. Dessa told him about the years after her mother died, when Frank had been working difficult country, and had brought her along because there was nowhere else for her to go, and she had learned everything she knew about reading land and weather and people from those years of following him through conditions that did not accommodate a child, and simply required her to become someone who could keep up. He told her about the early years of the ranch before Clara, when the place had been barely functional and he had made most of the structural decisions that still governed how the water and the fences and the buildings were arranged. Most of them correct, and a few of them things he would change now if starting over. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without preparing her response while he was still speaking. One evening she told him about a dream she had the previous night in which Frank appeared, occupied with some kind of work she couldn't identify in the way dreams obscure detail. Not diminished, not sad, just Frank. Going about something with his characteristic efficiency. He was satisfied, she said. That was the feeling of it. He was satisfied. Holt looked at his hands on the table. He would be. She looked at him in the lamplight. He looked back. Neither of them needed to say what both of them understood, that this was what Frank had been building toward with his letter and his trust and his final arrangement, and that the satisfaction in the dream was real in the way that some things felt real even when they arrived through sleep. He found the box in the 3rd week of June. He had been clearing the back room, the room Dessa had used in the first weeks, now converted to general storage in the way that extra rooms in working houses always found a use, and under the iron bed frame, where it had sat long enough that the floor around it was clean in a rectangle while the rest of the boards had gathered the usual dust, was a wooden box, not large, the size of a small drawer, with a hinged lid. He knew what it was before he touched it. He sat on the floor of the back room with the box in his lap for a while without opening it. The afternoon light came through the small window at an angle that caught the dust he had disturbed, holding it briefly visible before it settled again. He opened it. Inside, a piece of yellow fabric, soft, uncut, folded with care, small enough to hold in one hand, a string of wooden beads, light-colored, the kind strung for small hands to hold, a single skein of thin white yarn still wound on itself, never started, and underneath, a piece of paper folded twice in Clara's handwriting. He did not read it. It was not his to read. Whatever Clara had written to a child who had not come was between them in a place that did not need him to enter. He folded the paper back along its creases and set it carefully on top of the fabric. He sat in the back room for a long time. This was different from the grief he had carried for 7 years. 7 years of grief for a person specific, located, the grief of missing someone who had been present and was no longer. This was grief for a life that had been possible and had not happened. For a child expected and never arrived. For a morning that had never come, where he would have sat at the kitchen table differently than he had ever sat at it. It had a precise location, this grief. Not the diffuse ache of the long years. Something specific. The way a splinter that has been deep enough to stop hurting can be found again when something gets close enough to reach it. He closed the box, carried it to the kitchen table, set it there. When Dessa came in from the east pasture in the late afternoon, dust on her shirt, her hair slightly loosened from the work, she stopped in the doorway and looked at the box on the table, and then at him. He did not explain. She could read the situation without explanation, which was one of her most reliable qualities and one he had stopped finding surprising. She crossed the kitchen, sat across from him, put her hand on top of the box, not opening it, just her hand resting on the lid. Present, Clara had good hands, he said. His voice came rougher than he expected, not from emotion performing itself, but from the plain effort of saying something true. Small but strong. She could do work that surprised people who hadn't watched her before. She did not look like someone who could do the things she did and then she did them. Dessa did not fill the space after he spoke. She had the right kind of patience for a child. He looked at the box, at Dessa's hand on it, not tolerance, the active kind, where you're genuinely interested in who a person is turning out to be. He looked up at her. My father told me something the winter before he got sick, Dessa said quietly. He said the people who love us don't want us to seal off the rooms of our life to keep them preserved. They want us to live in every room. She paused. He was talking about himself, about what he wanted for me after he was gone. But it goes both directions. The kitchen held that. The lamp was not yet lit. It was still late afternoon light through the window, long and gold, and holding the ordinary things of the room in a way that made them look like what they were. A table, 2 plates on a shelf, a box with a hinged lid, a man and a woman on opposite sides of all of it, and also somehow on the same side. Holt reached out and set his hand over hers on the lid, 2 hands on the box. The kitchen around them going slowly toward evening. Clara would have liked you, he said. The kind of sentence that is either too much or exactly right with no space between those 2 possibilities. She would have watched you work and made her own conclusions, and then told me what they were, because she always told me the things I needed to hear at the exact moment I was least prepared to hear them. She would have told me you were worth paying attention to. He paused. She would have told me that months ago, probably. The corner of Dessa's mouth moved in the way it moved when something was true and she was letting it land without managing the landing. Frank would have done the same, she said. He would have watched you for about 15 minutes and told me you were adequate, and then told every other person he met that you were the finest rancher in New Mexico territory and they should be paying more attention. A pause. He would have meant both things. Something in Holt's chest that had been arranged in a particular way for 7 years shifted. Not broke, not released in any dramatic sense, shifted. The way ice shifted in late February before anything was truly warm, the first sign of a change that would take time but had unmistakably begun. He started the cradle in the last week of June. He did not announce it. He selected the wood pine from the tree line at the north edge of the property, a section that had come down in a winter storm 3 years back and had been drying properly ever since, tight-grained and stable, and began in the evenings after supper, in the barn where the light from the west window was still good for an hour after the day's work ended. He worked on it without explaining what it was for. It was evident. Dessa knew. She appeared in the barn doorway on the second evening with a lamp, which she set on the feed trunk in a position that improved his light without comment, and then sat on a hay bale and worked on something of her own. He could not see what from his angle, and stayed until he stopped for the night. She came the third evening. The fourth. Every evening after, they did not discuss the cradle while he built it. They talked about other things: the water level in the South Creek after a dry week, a hawk that had been hunting the north pasture every afternoon for 2 weeks with unusual persistence. A story Frank had told her about a cattle drive in the Texas Panhandle that had gone sideways in 3 separate directions simultaneously and had ended with everyone alive and nothing where it was supposed to be. Dessa had a way of telling stories about Frank that made him present without making him a memorial, as though he was simply someone who had existed and still existed in the specific way that people existed when you carried them accurately. The cradle took 3 weeks. When it was finished, he carried it into the house and set it in the bedroom with the east window, the room that got the morning light first. That would be warm before the rest of the house was. That was the right room for what it was going to hold. He stood in the doorway looking at it for a while. It was plain he did not have the skill for decorative work and had not attempted it. But the joints were tight, the wood smooth, the rocking motion even and quiet. It would hold what it needed to hold, and it would last. Dessa came and stood beside him in the doorway. She looked at the cradle in the morning light coming through the east window, the grain of the pine visible in the long angle of it, all the tight parallel lines of the wood running together. She did not speak for a while. Then, "It's good work, it'll do," he said, which was how he always responded to something he had made that he was genuinely satisfied with. She looked at it for another moment, then looked at him, and her eyes held the full measure of what the cradle represented, not just the object, but everything that had preceded its construction. The box in the back room, the yellow fabric, the letter folded twice, the 7 years of sealed rooms, the gate opened before sunrise, the 2 shadows in the water, the courthouse hallway and Chester's locked drawer, and Mabel Pruitt crossing the street with her hands folded. All of it present in her expression, acknowledged and held. Frank would have pretended not to care about it, she said, and then stood here for a long time finding things to say about the joinery, and then cried. In private, after said simply, not as sentiment, as fact. Holt looked at the cradle. He was allowed. Yes, she said. He was. The morning of the 3rd day of March arrived cold and clear, the way March mornings did in New Mexico when winter had not fully decided to release its hold, but the sun had grown strong enough to make the argument. 8 months had passed since the courthouse. The ranch had moved through a full cycle of seasons with 2 people in it, and the shape of the days had reorganized itself around that fact so completely that the previous arrangement had become difficult to remember with any precision, the way it was difficult to remember what a room had looked like before furniture you now relied on had been moved into it. Holt was at the well before full light, the bucket in his hands, the rope running clean and smooth through the pulley housing, the ritual of it as natural as breathing 15 years of the same action at the same hour, same depth, same cold weight of the full bucket coming up. His mind was not particularly occupied. This was one of the small gifts of physical routine. The body operated while the mind rested, and the resting was real rest because the body was doing something that mattered. He heard the house door open, then the particular sound of footsteps on the porch boards, and then the 3 steps down to the yard, not hurrying. Moving with the specific quality of intention rather than urgency, he did not turn immediately. He pulled the bucket up the last few feet and set it on the stone lip. Holt, her voice. He turned. She was standing at the edge of the yard, one hand against the post at the bottom of the porch steps, the early light making the detail of her face easier to read than might be expected at this hour, because the light was coming directly and she was not moving away from it. She had been up for a while. She was in her work clothes, her hair down, and there was the particular stillness about her that appeared when she had made up her mind about something and was moving toward saying it. She came across the yard, stopped in front of him, and she took his hand, the one not on the bucket handle, and she brought it forward and placed it, with deliberate precision, against her. The bucket slipped from his other hand. He heard it land on the stones. Heard the water go across them in the way water moved when it had been released from where it was being held, finding the low places, following the grain of the stone, going quietly wherever the ground was willing to receive it. He did not move. The yard was absolutely still. The light was doing what it did in early March, coming in at an angle that made every edge precise, every surface fully itself. The barn at its particular angle, the cottonwood with the sideways branch, the north fence running straight to the tree line. He was aware of his hand, of what it rested against, of the information traveling through his palm into the rest of him. He thought not in sequence, not in words exactly, but the way understanding arrived when it came all at once rather than incrementally, of a winter evening 7 years ago, of standing outside a closed door with a cup of water that was not sufficient, of a wooden box in the back room with yellow fabric inside it and a letter folded twice, of a ceiling he had studied from below for a very long time, of 2 plates on a shelf that he had never reduced to 1. He thought of Frank's letter, of the last line. "You said that like it was a fact. I disagreed then. I disagree now." He thought of a gate opened before sunrise, of 72 days recorded in a careful hand, of a drawing of 2 shadows in water. He thought, "She is going to be a mother." The sentence moved through him the way real understanding moved, arriving fully rather than edging in, taking up the space it was entitled to rather than the space available. He thought, "I am going to be a father." He had said those words inside himself before. In the early years, when it had still seemed like a thing that was coming, he had thought them with the mild confidence of a man who expected the future to cooperate. He had never thought them with this specific weight, the weight of something that had been in doubt, something that had been closed and sealed and given back, not given back the same way. Not Clara, not the child who had not come. Nothing that had been lost was being returned. Something new, something that had not existed before this morning. He stepped forward, his arms went around her, not quickly, not with the urgency of relief, carefully, the way a person held something they understood the weight of completely. She put her hand against his chest and left it there. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. Neither of them spoke. The water from the spilled bucket spread across the yard stones, finding the cracks, following the slope, going where the ground led it. After a long moment she said quietly, into the space between them, "He's going to need a name." He lifted his head, looked at her, he, the corner of her mouth, that small precise movement, or she, a pause. "I have a sense." He looked at her face in the March morning light, at the person who had arrived at his gate before sunrise with everything she owned under one arm, and had over the course of 1 season repaired every fence on the property and drawn his hands at the well and stood in a county hallway and called a man wrong with the evidence to prove it, and sat in a barn during a dust storm, and placed a letter from her father on a kitchen table, and said yes to a man who had nearly convinced himself that word had no remaining application to his life. "Frank," he said. She looked at him. If he's a he held her gaze. Frank. She was quiet. The horses shifted in the barn. The meadowlark that had been working the north pasture for 2 weeks started up and then was still again, and then started again, and the creek in the distance ran under all of it the way it always ran, continuous and unhurried and indifferent to what was happening on the banks, which was its right, and also somehow a comfort. He would have pretended not to care about that either, she said finally, and then told everyone. A pause. Within the hour, Holt held on. The light continued to do what light did in early March, spreading across the yard from the east, finding the surfaces of things, making the ordinary facts of the place visible in the specific way that morning light made things visible, not by adding anything but by showing what was already there. Edmund Cray left Rio Blanco County that September. No announcement, no explanation offered to anyone who was owed one. His office was cleared over a weekend, and by Monday the desk was empty, and Chester had new forms to learn. The railroad survey crew arrived in October and spent 3 weeks completing their assessment. The route they recommended ran further south than the corridor. Cray had been clearing through open country below the creek, where acquisition was less complicated, and the land was already free of the arrangements that would have had to be unwound. The people who had backed Cray's operation lost interest in the county when the route changed, which was the nature of that kind of interest. It moved to where it was useful and stopped being present everywhere else. Mabel Pruitt said she had expected something like that. She was not the only one. The town continued its adjustment. Its adjustments were never total or immediate. Nothing real ever was. There were people whose positions did not shift, and would not shift without more time or evidence than they were likely to encounter. Dessa navigated this with the same even attention she brought to every other element of the landscape that did not cooperate, not ignoring it, not fighting it unnecessarily, accounting for it in the calculation of where she moved and how. But there were also people who moved more than Holt would have expected. In the way that people sometimes surprised you when a fact became established and they had to locate themselves relative to it, rather than relative to their anticipation of it. Tom Briggs at the feed store was uncomplicated. He extended the same practical respect to anyone who clearly knew what they were doing, which was his only real standard for anyone, and had always been. The Hadley sisters' conversation about embroidery had become a standing exchange. Chester greeted her with specific warmth of a man who considers himself present at something that mattered and takes that seriously. The cradle was in use by the following November, 8 months after the morning at the well. When the child Frank Running Bear Brennan arrived in the room with the east window on a cold, clear night and filled the house with a sound it had never held before and would hold from then on. Holt stood in the doorway of that room for a long time on the first night, listening, one evening in the spring after that, Frank 4 months old and already demonstrating, through the intensity with which he observed everything around him, that he was going to see the world the way his mother saw it, which Holt considered among the best possible outcomes. Holt carried a second chair outside, not the porch chair, a different one, made over the winter in the evenings when Dessa was feeding the baby, and the house had taken on its new sound, the sound of a small person learning how to be in the world and requiring considerable company in the process. He had made the chair without a particular plan, just because his hands needed something to do in those evenings, and wood was the material he knew. It had turned out well, solid, evenly jointed, comfortable in the way of things made for actual use rather than appearance. He set it beside the porch chair. The porch chair faced east, where it had always faced. The new chair he angled slightly, not opposite but beside, and turned a few degrees differently, so that 2 people sitting in them would share most of the same view without being exactly parallel. He stood back and looked at the arrangement, then decided it was right and went inside. Dessa came out after Frank was settled for the evening. She stopped at the door when she saw the 2 chairs, looked at them, looked at the new one specifically. He sat in the porch chair. She sat in the new one. The angle gave them different foreground, and the same horizon, the hills going dark at their edges, the sky above, still holding the last of the evening color, the stars beginning to appear one at a time in the east where the dark arrived first. They sat without talking for a while. The ranch had its evening sounds, horses in the barn, the creek in the distance, the gate hinge moving slightly in a breeze that came and went. And from inside the house occasionally, the small sounds of Frank in his sleep, which were different from the sounds of a house with no one in it in every way that mattered. Frank would say, Dessa began, and stopped. He waited. He would say, he told me so. She looked at the hills going dark, and he would be right, and he would not make it small by gloating. He would say it once and let it stand. He would, right, Holt said. Yes, so were you? She turned to look at him. He looked back at her in the evening light, which was nearly gone now. Just the sky and the early stars and the warm air that would cool in another hour. Her face was the face he had been looking at for more than a year and had still not finished looking at, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether he had chosen well. About what? She said, coming through the gate. She was quiet for a moment. In the house behind them, a small sound from the room with the east window, not distress, just the unconscious movement of someone small and deeply asleep. She listened for it to settle, and it did, and she turned back toward the hills. "I came for 1 season," she said. And there was something in the way she said it that carried both what the sentence had meant and what it meant now. Both things held at once, the before and the after, neither one erasing the other. The way Frank had always held two things. The way she had learned to. "You stayed," Holt said. The stars were fully out. The hills had gone completely dark. The creek ran in the distance the way it always ran, continuous and without agenda, moving through the valley in the dark the way it moved through it in the light, because water did not require an audience to do what it did. She looked at the sky. "My father used to say," she said, "that the good years always come back around. If you stay long enough to see them." He looked where she was looking. At the stars' campfires, according to Frank, left burning by the people who had walked before, so the ones who came after would know they were not the first. So they would know that someone had been here and lived here and left something that lasted. "He was talking about you," she said. Holt was quiet for a moment. The night held everything. It held the ranch and the creek and the sleeping child and the hills and the stars and the two of them on the porch in the chairs he had built and placed at the angle that made room for both. "Maybe," he said. He reached over. She was already reaching. Their hands found each other in the dark between the chairs and held, and the ranch spread before them in the night, and the stars burned above it. And inside the house, a child named for a man who had believed in second beginnings slept with the uncomplicated trust of someone who had no reason yet to doubt that the world intended to be good to him, Holt Brennan, who had once said his chance at certain things had passed and had said it like a fact, sat on the porch of his ranch with his wife's hand in his, and did not look back. He looked at what was in front of him, which was everything, more than everything. The kind of more that could not be planned for or earned through any particular merit, only received by a man willing to keep the gate unlocked on the chance that life had not finished with him. It had not, it never had.